flight was supposed to be nothing more than a routine crossing of the skies. But what unfolded inside that cabin became a storm no passenger could ignore. A young black girl sat quietly, her presence alone enough for cruelty to be drawn to her. Each moment of humiliation stacked higher, as if designed to crush her spirit. Around her, silence spread like a disease, passengers turning away while the weight of injustice settled heavily on her small shoulders. And all the while, a man close by remained still, his eyes unblinking, his silence deliberate, carrying a secret that none around him could grasp. Every insult pushed him closer to the moment when patience would no longer hold, when the mask would be torn away, and the truth of who he was would ignite shock through the cabin like fire through dry grass. What began as shame for a child would end in the collapse of arrogance and the restoration of dignity in front of every witness. If you feel the tension rising already, hit like, subscribe for more, and tell me in the comments what you think of this plot and where you're watching from. The airplane cabin was buzzing with the usual pre-flight sounds, the muted chatter of families finding their seats, the clattering of luggage wheels on the floor, and the constant thump of bags being shoved overhead. To anyone else, it was just another ordinary boarding, but for Talia Merrick, who clutched her faded purple backpack tightly, it was supposed to be an exciting journey. She was only 12, traveling with her father, but their assigned seats were separated by a row. She approached her place cautiously, easing her backpack into the seat pocket in front of her with a small sigh of relief, hoping she could settle before the plane filled entirely. The moment barely lasted a second. Without warning, Janice Rourke descended upon her with an authority sharpened by contempt. Her hand shot forward like a striking whip, seizing the backpack and yanking it so abruptly that Talia nearly jolted back. The pack was flung into the aisle with such force that it skidded against the legs of another passenger, drawing startled gasps. The cabin's chatter faltered as several heads turned. For a second, all eyes flickered between the trembling child and the rigid flight attendant. Talia bent down immediately, cheeks flushed, her small hands wrapping around the strap of her bag as if she were rescuing something precious. She pulled it close, the embarrassment washing over her like a heavy curtain. No one spoke, but silence carried its own judgment, and the unease rippled subtly through the rows. Janice was not finished. With exaggerated purpose, she plucked a tissue from her pocket and leaned into the seat Talia had just chosen. She pressed the paper into the fabric, scrubbing hard, swiping again and again as though she were purging contamination. Each motion was slow, deliberate, calculated to draw the attention of anyone watching. She did not glance at Talia, but stood back when she was done, flicking the tissue into a small trash pouch as if discarding something offensive. The girl froze, her shoulders stiff, unsure if she should apologize or hide, but her instinct told her to shrink into the seat and pretend not to exist. Around her, passengers exchanged silent messages in raised brows and tightened lips. Some stared straight ahead, unwilling to intervene, while others shifted uneasily in their seats. The atmosphere grew heavy, stifling, and even the hum of the engines seemed to fade under the weight of unspoken discomfort. Talia placed her backpack on her lap now, unwilling to risk losing it again, and folded her arms over it protectively. Her breathing was shallow, and she pressed her eyes downward, fixated on the patterned carpet at her feet. From one row back, Elias Merrick watched in stillness. He was a tall man in his late 40s, broad-shouldered and composed, dressed casually in civilian clothes that concealed the weight of his true identity. His gaze followed Janice as she moved away, noting every detail of her conduct, from the stiffness in her stride to the casual arrogance in her expression. He did not intervene yet, his silence not born of fear, but of patience. There was a steadiness in his demeanor that contrasted starkly with the turbulence he could sense building around his daughter. Elias knew restraint and he knew timing. Now was not the moment. Talia sat rigidly as boarding continued. People filed past, some pausing with sympathetic eyes, others pretending not to notice. Every glance only deepened her sense of humiliation. She wondered if she had somehow done something wrong by placing her backpack where everyone else placed theirs. Her fingers tightened on the strap, her small knuckles whitening. her heart beating faster than the plane's own mechanical thrum. She wanted to disappear into the fabric of her seat. Janice carried on with her duties as if nothing had happened, moving briskly down the aisle, her hands arranging baggage, her posture stiff and commanding. But the impression she left behind lingered. Her contempt was not a fleeting gesture, but an opening statement, one that set the tone for what would follow. The imbalance of power was clear, an adult in uniform using her position to make a child feel smaller, weaker, and out of place. The flight attendants' rehearsed announcements played over the intercom, instructing passengers to buckle their seatbelts, turn off devices, and prepare for departure. Yet beneath the official language, a different reality simmered quietly. For Talia, the plane no longer felt like an adventure or even a journey. It felt like confinement, a space where she was not welcome. She curled slightly inward, gripping the blanket folded on her seat, but she dared not use it. The memory of Janice's wiping gesture was too fresh, as though the seat itself had been marked against her. The engines roared louder now, signaling imminent takeoff. But to Talia, the sound was muffled by the rush of her own pulse in her ears. She peeked briefly toward her father. He remained calm, his face unreadable, his hands folded neatly in his lap, but his eyes carried an unspoken promise. For now, he would let the storm brew, but storms have a way of circling back. Elias Merrick remained silent one row back, his eyes still fixed on the attendant who had demeaned his daughter, his composure as calm as stone, yet his awareness sharper than anyone could imagine. Janice walked the narrow aisle with the authority of someone who believed her position gave her license to belittle. Her shoulders squared, her chin tilted slightly upward, and her eyes moving quickly from passenger to passenger as though scanning for her next opportunity to assert power. Her target did not have to be guilty of anything. Her satisfaction came from creating the impression of guilt. She reached Talia's row again, her hands resting on her hips with a sharpness that turned heads. Without hesitation, she leaned forward and plucked the small pillow from Talia's hands, the very pillow the child had pulled down in hopes of resting during the long flight. Janice carried it casually to the aisle seat beside a middle-aged white woman and handed it off without explanation. The woman looked startled, but too uncomfortable to protest, her eyes darting to Talia with something that resembled pity. But she said nothing. The child's hands, now empty, hovered in the air for a second before lowering slowly, her body folding inward as though trying to reduce herself to nothing. The message was clear. Comforts were not for her. Janice turned sharply and continued her routine, the heels of her shoes clicking faintly on the floor. A few passengers exchanged uneasy glances, but again silence prevailed. They chose self-preservation over confrontation, and in that silence, the injustice deepened its roots. Talia's gaze dropped to the floor, her lips pressed tightly together, her breathing uneven. She felt the heat of embarrassment spread across her cheeks, aware that others had seen the deliberate act, but also aware that no one would stop it. The engines roared louder as the aircraft picked up speed on the runway, pressing passengers back into their seats. The vibrations rattled loose items, but within Talia's heart, the shaking had already begun long before the plane left the ground. Minutes later, as the plane leveled into the sky and the seatbelt sign remained lit, Janice returned with the beverage cart. Her eyes skimmed over the rows with that same clinical detachment, but when she reached Talia's row, her movements shifted, deliberate once more. As she maneuvered the cart, she angled it carelessly so that the corner struck against Talia's shin with a dull thud. The girl flinched, her hand instinctively moving to the sore spot, but Janice offered no acknowledgement, no pause, not even a glance of regret. She kept pushing forward, as though the contact were nothing more than an inconvenience to herself. Talia's leg throbbed, her body recoiling into the seat, yet she made no sound. Around her, passengers noticed, their eyes briefly flicking toward the child before dropping quickly back to their trays or magazines, each one unwilling to speak. The absence of words was deafening. The humiliation was not always loud. Sometimes it lived in the small, calculated gestures that carried venom without needing a voice. To the casual observer, Janice's actions might have seemed accidental, but to those who had seen the pattern unfold, It was unmistakable. The contempt was deliberate, the cruelty rehearsed. Talia curled tighter into herself, her backpack still gripped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white against the faded fabric. She glanced sideways at the window, the sky stretching endlessly beyond the glass, a place where she wished she could escape. Instead, she was trapped in a seat that now felt smaller with every passing minute, suffocated by the judgment of one woman and the silence of many. Elias Merrick continued to watch, his body still and composed. His silence was a decision, not a weakness. Every detail, every action of Janice's cruelty was being measured and stored, written into his mind with precision. He knew timing, he knew restraint, and he knew that one act of intervention too soon could rob the moment of its full reckoning. For now, he allowed the venom to spread, allowed witnesses to absorb it, for there would come a time when the balance would shift, and when it did, silence would no longer bind him. The plane continued its steady ascent, clouds drifting lazily past the windows, but the air inside remained thick with tension. Some passengers adjusted their headphones or opened books, pretending to ignore the drama, but the unease lingered in the way they fidgeted, the way they glanced quickly, then looked away. They were unwilling participants in a performance of cruelty, bound together by complicity born of fear and discomfort. Talia, trapped in the center of it, felt each second drag heavier, her small body hunched in defense against an attack she could not predict. Janice, satisfied with her subtle display, parked the cart a few rows ahead and busied herself with service, but her earlier actions remained etched into the cabin. They were not isolated incidents, but pieces of a pattern that revealed her nature. She relished control, thrived on belittlement, and wielded authority like a weapon. And though her face carried the mask of professionalism, her gestures betrayed her arrogance, her certainty that she would never be challenged. Yet behind her, a pair of watchful eyes belonged to a man who had seen far more dangerous adversaries, and who would not remain silent forever. Around her, people pretended to focus on the view out the windows or their own belongings, but their stolen glances betrayed the fact that they had witnessed cruelty unfold and had done nothing. Elias Merrick sat behind her, unmoving, his composure almost statuesque. His silence was a mask, but behind it his eyes recorded every detail with precision. He had endured worse storms and faced greater threats, yet he knew the true measure of cruelty lay in its persistence. This flight attendant was not finished, and he could see it in the sharp angles of her movements and the cold satisfaction in her eyes each time she passed his daughter's row. Janice Rourke returned again, her posture upright, her gaze sharp as she surveyed the cabin with the authority of someone who believed no one would ever challenge her. Her eyes flicked to Talia, narrowing in faint recognition of the vulnerability she had already carved into the girl. She reached up to the overhead bin above Talia's row and pulled it open with a swift motion. Inside was the small carry-on Talia had struggled to lift earlier with the help of another passenger. Without a word, Janice shoved it harshly into the farthest corner of the bin, pushing it so deep that the child could never retrieve it on her own. The thud of the suitcase echoed slightly, drawing glances from the nearby seats. It was not a gesture of organization, it was a gesture of dominance. Talia's eyes followed the suitcase as it disappeared from reach, her throat tightening, her lips pressed into a line as her hands gripped her lap tighter. She knew she would not be able to retrieve it without help, and she knew Janice had done it deliberately. The humiliation burned quietly, invisible to anyone who wanted to pretend it was merely part of routine service, but deeply painful to the one who endured it. Janice snapped the bin closed and pivoted sharply, her steps carrying her back down the aisle. She made a brief stop at the galley before circling again, her eyes always scanning, seeking. When she reached Talia's row for the second time, she paused deliberately. The girl had opened her small bag that she kept by her feet, pulling out a simple water bottle to soothe her dry throat. Her hands were small, her movements tentative, but before she could unscrew the cap, Janice's hand shot forward. She yanked the bag from the child's lap with calculated aggression, unzipping it with exaggerated speed, her fingers rummaging through the contents as if searching for contraband. The water bottle was lifted high, displayed briefly, then tossed carelessly to the floor where it rolled under the row of seats. Janice returned the bag with a dismissive flick, the zipper left half undone, as if the contents inside no longer mattered. Without a glance at Talia, she turned and strode away, her heels clicking against the narrow aisle. The water bottle lay abandoned, just out of reach, a small yet sharp symbol of humiliation. Passengers had seen it. They had seen the bag ripped away, the bottle thrown aside, the child left clutching the open bag as her eyes glistened with the effort of holding back tears. Yet again, no one intervened. A man in a business suit shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. A young woman pulled her sweater tighter around herself, staring firmly out the window. Silence prevailed because silence was easier. For Janice, that silence was validation, proof that her actions would carry no consequences. For Talia, it was confirmation that she was utterly alone in this confined space, with no shield except her own endurance. The engines droned steadily, and the plane cut through the clouds, but the real turbulence lived inside the cabin where cruelty had taken root. Each act seemed small when isolated, but together they built a chain, heavy and undeniable, wrapped around a child's dignity. Elias Merrick saw it all. His jaw remained tight, his body still, his eyes sharp. He measured every movement, every gesture, every flinch of his daughter's small shoulders as she tried to compose herself. Patience was his weapon now. He knew when to act, but he also knew the weight of letting cruelty reveal itself fully before striking back. He allowed the silence to stretch because when the time came, that silence would transform into a reckoning no one could ignore. Talia leaned sideways in her seat, trying to glance at her water bottle lodged under the chair in front of her, but she did not dare ask for help. Her throat was dry, but her fear was greater. She curled her arms tightly around her lap, pulling her open bag closer, guarding what little remained as her own. Every small possession seemed threatened now, every moment laced with the possibility of further humiliation. The comfort of travel was gone, replaced by a steady dread that grew heavier with each step Janice took down the aisle. The passengers could feel it too, the way the energy in the cabin was no longer relaxed, but tense, watchful, uneasy. They wanted to pretend it was not happening, to bury themselves in headphones or magazines, but the memory of each action lingered in the periphery of their awareness. The cruelty was not invisible. It was deliberate, sharp, and performed in plain sight. And while silence offered temporary safety, it also tied them to the performance as unwilling witnesses. The wound had already been carved deep, but Janice Rourke was not finished. She carried herself back down the aisle with a crisp stride, her uniform pressed, her posture exaggerated with authority, her gaze sweeping the rows until her eyes settled once again on Talia. For Janice, the earlier humiliations were not enough. She craved an audience for the performance of disdain. She reached into her service pouch and withdrew a packet of tissues, her expression coldly calculated, and handed one to the young white boy sitting beside Talia. With a slight motion of her head and a narrowing of her eyes, she indicated toward the girl, the silent signal unmistakable. The boy looked confused for a moment, but under the weight of her gaze, he obediently pressed the tissue against his nose. The implication was cruelly clear. Passengers nearby caught the exchange, and several adults shifted uneasily, some frowning, others choosing to avert their eyes. The message was not spoken aloud, but it was louder than words. Talia's eyes widened slightly, the sting cutting deeper than before, her face flushing hot as she realized she had been reduced to something shameful in front of strangers. Her fingers dug into the fabric of her bag, as though anchoring herself against the wave of humiliation that threatened to pull her under. Janice turned sharply, her heels clicking on the narrow aisle floor, and continued toward the galley as though she had accomplished nothing more than routine service. But the performance had landed its mark. The boy beside Talia kept the tissue awkwardly in place, his cheeks red with discomfort, unsure of why he had been made part of the act, while Talia sank lower into her seat, her chest tight, her breath shallow, her sense of belonging stripped further away. Elias Merrick's eyes never wavered from the scene. He had seen the tissue exchange, the cold signaling, the ripple of shame that had spread across his daughter's small face. He remained silent, but his silence now was filled with a deeper intensity, each act of cruelty stored like evidence, each humiliation added to the ledger of what was owed. He measured every second with a soldier's precision, waiting for the point where restraint would give way to revelation. The minutes crawled as the plane cut through open skies, but Janice returned again, her gaze sharper, her gestures more deliberate. The fastened seatbelt sign flickered back on as turbulence rocked the plane lightly, the cabin shuddering just enough to make passengers grip their armrests. Janice used the moment to lean over Talia, tugging at her seatbelt with unnecessary force. She yanked it so tight across the girl's small body that her shoulders pressed hard into the seat and her face twisted with discomfort. Without checking if it was safe or comfortable, Janice clicked the latch and stood upright, her expression flat, her actions dressed in the guise of duty but carried out with unmistakable malice. She walked away without a word, leaving Talia gasping quietly, her hands tugging uselessly at the strap that bit into her waist and chest. The girl sat rigid, her body trapped, her spirit battered by one humiliation after another. The turbulence passed, but the storm inside the cabin had grown thicker. Passengers watched, their silence now tinged with guilt, their discomfort palpable in their shifting positions and downcast eyes. They had seen too much to pretend it was nothing, but fear of confrontation chained their voices. The quiet complicity of the crowd gave Janice more power than her uniform ever could. Talia sat frozen, her arms stiff, her breathing shallow, her gaze locked on her shoes because she could not bear to look at anyone else. She had begun the flight with a child's excitement for travel, but now every second felt like a punishment she could not escape. Elias Merrick leaned back slightly, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, his gaze unwavering. His silence was no longer just patience, it was strategy. Each act added weight to what would eventually be unleashed, and he knew that when the time came, no one in that cabin would deny what had been done. For now, he let the performance continue, because sometimes justice required the cruelty to reveal itself fully before it could be dismantled completely. The tissue incident had marked her as something unwanted, and the deliberate tightening of the belt had left her bruised not only on her body, but on her dignity. She sat quietly, her hands folded tightly on her lap, trying to convince herself that if she did not move or speak, she might be left alone. Yet Janice Rourke, prowling the aisle with her cold authority and unyielding arrogance, had no intention of leaving her alone. She had tasted the power of public shame and now sought to escalate it further, to make her cruelty undeniable. Janice moved with precision, her eyes glancing at passengers, but always settling on Talia with a predatory certainty. She pushed the service cart back into the aisle, its rattling wheels echoing in the heavy air. One by one, she handed trays to passengers, her professional facade intact for everyone except the girl she had singled out. When she reached Talia's row, she looked down at the child's small tray table, lowered neatly in front of her, and instead of placing a meal there, she turned sharply and walked past. Moments later, she returned with a tray in her hands, but instead of giving it to Talia, she carried it 2 rows back and placed it on an empty seat. She then returned to the aisle and announced that all meal portions were finished, her voice flat but loud enough for those nearby to hear. Talia sat frozen, the humiliation clawing deeper, her eyes stinging as her stomach tightened with hunger and the knowledge that she had been deliberately excluded. The people around her noticed, some shifting uncomfortably, but none dared to challenge the lie. Janice continued her service without a pause, carrying trays to passengers who had already been served, offering second helpings to those she deemed worthy, further underscoring the injustice. Talia's small fingers curled into fists against her lap, but she made no sound, her silence both a defense and a prison. Elias Merrick saw everything from behind, his steady gaze locked on the scene. His expression did not change, but his patience was stretched thinner with each act of cruelty. He stored it, measured it, allowed it to build, because he knew the timing of revelation would matter more than the impulse of anger. Justice would come, but it would not come prematurely. Time passed slowly as trays clattered, utensils scraped against plastic, and the smell of food filled the cabin. Talia sat without a tray, her body small and still, her shame burning hotter than her hunger. She could feel eyes on her, pitying eyes, judgmental eyes, eyes that chose to look away quickly, as though refusing to acknowledge her suffering would make it less real. The isolation wrapped tighter around her shoulders, and she pressed her hands against her knees to keep them from trembling. She wanted to cry, but she would not give Janice the satisfaction of seeing her tears. When the meals were cleared away, Janice made another calculated return to Talia's row. She moved briskly, the garbage bag swinging loosely in her hand, collecting wrappers and cups. As she reached Talia, she paused briefly, her eyes scanning the small bag at the girl's feet. Talia hesitated, then slowly opened the bag, pulling out a small pack of cookies she had saved for herself, something familiar to comfort her in the middle of humiliation. She held it delicately, her hands almost trembling, but before she could open it, Janice swooped down, plucking the package from her grasp and dropping it into the garbage bag as though it were contraband. The sound of the crinkling wrapper being crushed against trash pierced the cabin like a cruel note. Talia's lips parted slightly, her chest tightening as she stared at her empty hands, the last piece of comfort ripped away from her with calculated malice. Janice did not look at her as she pushed the cart forward, her face a mask of indifference, her posture tall and confident, as though she had simply carried out a duty. The passengers had seen it just as they had seen everything else. Their silence had become an accomplice, their refusal to speak up another layer of cruelty. The guilt pressed heavier now, their shifting seats and lowered gazes betraying their discomfort. Some wanted to rise to speak, but the weight of fear, the fear of confrontation, the fear of being targeted next, held them down. Silence became their shield, but it was also their shame. Talia sat motionless, her small fists clenched tightly, her nails digging into her palms. Her eyes burned, but no tears fell. She stared forward, the seat in front of her blurring, the sound of the engines mixing with the pounding of her heart. Every act of humiliation carved deeper, and yet she endured it, carrying a strength she did not yet understand she possessed. Her body was small, but her resilience, though hidden, was growing with each assault. She was not broken, only bent under the weight of cruelty, waiting for the storm that would lift the burden away. Elias Merrick leaned forward slightly, his broad frame filling the space of his seat, his gaze unwavering. He saw the moment his daughter lost her meal. He saw the moment her cookies were taken. He saw the way her shoulders stiffened against the humiliation. His silence was no longer just observation, but a choice heavy with purpose. He knew what was coming, and he allowed the cruelty to stretch further because he understood one truth. The more public the humiliation, the more undeniable the justice would be when it arrived. Her father, Elias Merrick, still sat behind her, his face calm but his eyes fixed with unrelenting attention, his silence as deliberate as the cruelty unfolding in front of him. He let each moment build because he knew there would be a reckoning, but it would not come before the cruelty revealed its full depth. Janice Rourke returned once more, her steps sharp, her eyes cold with the satisfaction of a predator that had already marked its prey. Her movements were brisk as she patrolled the aisle, but when she neared Talia's row, she slowed, her gaze flickering toward the girl like a hawk circling prey. She stopped abruptly, her hand reaching down to the small rolling suitcase tucked neatly under Talia's seat. With a sharp tug, she pulled it out into the aisle, the sound of plastic wheels scraping against the floor drawing attention. Instead of pushing it back neatly or allowing it to remain in place, she left it sitting squarely in the middle of the aisle, a deliberate obstacle. Passengers shifted their feet uncomfortably, forced to step around the suitcase as they moved to the restroom or returned from stretching. Each person glanced down at the suitcase, then quickly away, unwilling to acknowledge what they saw. Another deliberate humiliation disguised as routine. Talia sat frozen, her eyes locked on the suitcase, her chest rising and falling in uneven breaths, shame flooding her small body as if the suitcase itself had become a beacon marking her as unworthy. The shame was heavy, but the cruelty had not yet reached its peak. Janice returned minutes later, carrying a stack of thin blankets folded crisply against her arm. She distributed them to passengers across the rows, her gestures mechanical and professional until she reached Talia. With a flick of her wrist, she threw a blanket onto the girl's lap, not as a gesture of kindness, but as if casting something unclean over her presence. The fabric landed harshly, sliding across Talia's small frame before pooling in her lap. Janice did not linger. She turned and walked away without pause, but her gesture had carried its message clearly. The blanket was not given as warmth, but as a cover, as though Talia's very existence needed to be hidden from view. The cruelty had been growing since the first act, and now it had evolved into a ritual of erasure. Talia's eyes welled, her hands gripping the edge of the blanket tightly, torn between throwing it off in defiance or clutching it to shield herself. She sat trapped in indecision, the humiliation pressing down harder than the fabric itself. Around her, the passengers grew even more restless. Some looked openly disturbed, some stared pointedly at Janice as she walked away, but still no one spoke. Their silence was louder than any protest could have been, filling the cabin with complicity and fear. Every one of them knew what was happening, but every one of them chose comfort over courage. Elias Merrick did not move, but his stillness had shifted. His jaw was set tighter now, his hands clasped firmly, his eyes sharp and unblinking. He had seen enough to understand the trajectory of cruelty, and though he had not acted, it was not because he lacked will. He had chosen patience with precision, letting the evidence stack itself higher with each act, because he knew the moment of revelation would only be more powerful when the cruelty had fully exposed itself in front of every witness. His daughter endured, her strength hidden in her silence, her resilience stretched but not yet broken. He watched her small shoulders quiver under the weight of humiliation, and he stored the image away, another tally in the ledger of what Janice had made inevitable. The cabin air felt heavier now, thick with the tension of what had been seen and what had been left unchallenged. The passengers could feel it, even if they refused to say it. They shifted uneasily, fidgeting with their armrests or their seatbelts, pretending to read magazines they had not opened, pretending to listen to music they had not turned on. They were witnesses trapped in their own silence, and the shame of their inaction clung to them as much as Janice's cruelty clung to her victim. The plane continued to cut through the sky, its path steady, but inside, the turbulence was moral, not mechanical. Talia pressed the blanket into her lap, her hands trembling slightly as she clung to it. She wanted to be invisible, but she also wanted to be free. Every act of humiliation carved away at her sense of belonging, each one heavier than the last. But still she sat with her head held just high enough to keep from collapsing entirely. She endured, because that was all she could do. But in her silence, in her small defiance of tears, there was also strength. She did not know it yet, but the very endurance she displayed was the proof her father needed, the reason he allowed his silence to stretch longer. Janice walked briskly back toward the galley, her posture straight, her expression cold and unrepentant. She believed her authority had protected her, believed her cruelty was safe under the shield of silence, believed she had successfully erased the presence of one child. But her arrogance blinded her to the truth. Every gesture she made, every humiliation she inflicted was being stored, being measured, and would eventually be turned against her in a reckoning she could not yet imagine. She sat with her eyes fixed downward, her young chest rising and falling in shallow, uneasy breaths, her body still tense from the humiliations that had been stacked on her shoulders since the very beginning of the flight. And behind her, Elias Merrick sat unmoving, his body solid, his gaze unbroken, his silence heavy with calculation. He had let every act of cruelty unfold because he understood the power of timing, and now the weight of it had reached its peak. The breaking point had passed, and the moment of revelation was close. Janice Rourke returned again, her shoes clicking down the narrow aisle with the same crisp rhythm, her eyes still hard with arrogance. She carried herself with the certainty of someone who believed she was untouchable, someone who believed her uniform and her authority made her immune to accountability. She slowed when she reached Talia's row, pausing to glance at the blanket in the girl's lap, her lip curling ever so slightly as though the sight of her victim's small, tense body gave her a secret satisfaction. She then moved on, striding toward the front of the plane. But in that very moment, Elias Merrick finally shifted. He had sat silent long enough, allowing every injustice to play out, but the time for silence had ended. With a deliberate movement, he rose from his seat. The passengers, who had grown accustomed to his stillness, turned their eyes toward him as he stood, his tall frame commanding attention without a word. He stepped into the aisle, his broad shoulders filling the narrow space, and walked slowly toward his daughter. The cabin, already heavy with tension, grew silent in anticipation. He reached Talia's row and bent down slightly, his large hand resting gently on her shoulder, his presence both protective and steady. She looked up, startled by his movement, her eyes wide, her small frame trembling under the sudden attention. For a moment she thought he might tell her to endure longer, but instead, with calm precision, he slid his hand under the blanket that had been forced upon her, lifted it away, and folded it neatly before setting it aside on the empty seat across the aisle. The gesture was simple, yet it carried a weight that every passenger felt. He was stripping away the symbol of her erasure, reclaiming her presence in that cabin for all to see. Then Elias did something more. He removed his coat, the plain civilian jacket he had worn throughout the flight, and folded it carefully over his arm. As he did, the fabric parted to reveal what he had concealed until now, the formal dress uniform beneath, tailored and precise, the dark fabric carrying an insignia stitched in gold thread across the chest. The insignia was not decorative. It was an emblem recognized by anyone who knew the symbols of the armed forces, a mark reserved only for officers of the highest rank. It gleamed subtly in the dim cabin lights, a quiet signal of authority far greater than the petty power Janice had been wielding. Passengers gasped softly, some leaning forward, others exchanging looks of recognition as their silence shifted from shame to shock. Elias adjusted the uniform with calm composure, his movements slow, deliberate, meant to ensure that every eye saw what he revealed. He did not speak, but his presence filled the space with a force more powerful than words. He reached upward, pulling from his jacket pocket a small case that he opened briefly, revealing a gleaming metal pin inside before sliding it onto his chest with steady hands. The metal was unmistakable to anyone with even the faintest knowledge of military honor, a national commendation for valor, a distinction so rare that seeing it outside of a formal ceremony was almost unthinkable. The passengers who understood sat straighter, their eyes wide, some with jaws slackened in awe. Talia watched in silence, her small hands trembling as she looked at her father with new eyes. She had always known him as strong, steady, protective, but she had never seen this side revealed, the side that commanded respect not just from her, but from strangers who now stared in astonishment. Her humiliation had weighed her down for hours, but now the weight shifted, replaced with a flicker of pride and safety that began to steady her trembling chest. The ripple through the cabin was immediate. A man in a nearby seat recognized the insignia and sat up sharply, whispering to his neighbor. A woman across the aisle pressed her hand to her mouth, her eyes filling with sudden respect. The silence that had once been complicit now became reverent, filled with the awareness that the man who had sat quietly through every act of cruelty was not just another passenger, but someone whose service had earned the highest regard. At the front of the plane, Janice turned back just in time to see Elias standing in the aisle, his uniform now visible, the insignia gleaming softly against his chest. Her face drained of color as recognition dawned. For the first time on the flight, her stride faltered. Her arrogance, built upon the belief that her authority was absolute, cracked under the weight of realization. She had not humiliated just any passenger. She had targeted the daughter of a man whose rank and honor carried more weight than she could ever wield. She froze briefly, her jaw tightening as though she wanted to maintain control, but her eyes betrayed the sudden fear that had pierced her certainty. Elias did not raise his voice. He did not make a scene. He did not need to. His presence alone transformed the cabin. Passengers who had sat silent now shifted, some nodding subtly, some adjusting in their seats, as though aligning themselves with him instinctively. The scales of power had shifted with one gesture, with one reveal, and the arrogance that had filled the cabin for so long was now drowned beneath the weight of his quiet authority. Talia felt her father's hand return to her shoulder, steady and warm, grounding her as he stood tall. She looked around and saw not just the fear on Janice's face, but the change in the passengers. The way they now looked at her not with pity, but with recognition of the injustice that had been done. She was no longer invisible, no longer erased. Her father had reclaimed her place with a single act, and the humiliation that had pressed on her chest began to lift. Talia Merrick sat in her seat beneath his hand, her wide eyes fixed on him, the fear and humiliation of the past hours slowly giving way to pride and security. The blanket that had been flung across her like an act of erasure now lay discarded, a symbol of cruelty undone by a greater presence. Around them, passengers leaned forward, their faces reflecting awe, guilt, and sudden understanding of what they had witnessed. For the first time during the flight, silence was not born of fear, but of respect. The ripple began with one man, an older veteran seated several rows back. He had watched the humiliations unfold like everyone else, his face tightening with unease. But when he saw the insignia on Elias's chest, he knew exactly what it meant. His body moved instinctively. He pushed himself up from his seat, standing tall despite the cramped cabin, and raised his hand in a sharp, practiced salute. The movement cut through the cabin like a blade, crisp and unmistakable, a gesture of respect from one soldier to another, one that could not be ignored. Heads turned instantly, passengers staring in shock as they realized what was happening. The recognition spread like fire. The woman across the aisle gasped softly and placed her hand against her mouth, whispering hurriedly to her husband. A young man in business attire leaned forward, his face pale, his eyes locked on Elias, as though seeing history in front of him. Another veteran, seated near the wing, followed suit, rising to his feet and saluting with equal precision. Within moments, the cabin had transformed into a space not of silence, but of collective acknowledgement. Passengers straightened, some placing hands over their hearts, others bowing their heads, each one moved by the weight of the revelation that the man they had ignored or underestimated was a figure of immense honor. Janice Rourke froze mid-step at the front of the plane. Her body stiffened, her hands gripping the edge of the service counter as her eyes locked on Elias. Her earlier arrogance drained from her face, replaced with a look that flickered between disbelief and dread. She had believed herself untouchable, her uniform a shield against accountability, but now she saw the truth. She had not simply tormented a child. She had humiliated the daughter of a man whose rank placed him at the very top of a chain of command that could determine her fate with a single report. The color drained from her cheeks, and for the first time, her certainty faltered. Elias did not speak. He did not need to. He stood tall, his chest steady, his presence commanding more than words ever could. His hand remained gently on Talia's shoulder, steady and protective, his gesture saying more than any rebuke. He was not merely defending his child. He was reclaiming her dignity in front of every witness who had allowed it to be stripped away. The passengers who had sat in guilty silence now looked at him with admiration and at Janice with condemnation. The scales of judgment had shifted irrevocably. Talia looked up at her father, her eyes shimmering with emotion she could not fully understand but could deeply feel. She had endured humiliation after humiliation, her small body shrinking under the weight of shame, yet now that same body straightened ever so slightly under his hand. She was still the same child, but the pride filling her chest gave her a new kind of strength. She saw the respect flooding the cabin, the way strangers now looked at her not with pity but with acknowledgement, and she understood that her father's silence had not been abandonment but strategy. Every cruel act had been allowed to build until this moment, and now the truth had turned humiliation into vindication. The captain emerged briefly from the cockpit, alerted by the whispers spreading through the cabin. His eyes scanned the scene, falling instantly on Elias. Recognition dawned quickly, and his expression shifted to one of deference. He gave a small nod before retreating, his posture confirming that he too understood the gravity of who stood among his passengers. Janice's hands trembled slightly as she attempted to compose herself, but her mask of authority had shattered. The passengers no longer respected her uniform. They saw only the cruelty it had cloaked. She tried to move, to step forward, but her feet felt heavy. Her every motion weighed down by the knowledge that her actions had been witnessed not only by dozens of passengers, but by a man whose authority reached further than she could ever imagine. Her arrogance had been her downfall, and the shame that spread across her face was now her own. Elias adjusted his uniform slightly, ensuring the insignia was visible to all. He did not speak, but his silence roared through the cabin. The passengers no longer looked away. They stared openly at Janice, their judgment clear. Some shook their heads, some whispered quietly to one another, but all of them knew that the tide had turned. No amount of denial could erase what had happened, because the presence of Elias Merrick had made it undeniable. The young boy who had been handed a tissue earlier sat frozen, his hands in his lap, his face flushed with guilt. He looked at Talia with wide eyes, the memory of his participation in her humiliation now unbearable. The older veteran who had first saluted remained standing, his posture rigid, his eyes unwavering on Elias, his gesture a beacon of respect that had sparked the transformation of the entire cabin. Talia breathed more steadily now, her small chest rising and falling with a rhythm that carried pride rather than fear. She leaned slightly into her father's steady hand, knowing she was protected, knowing she was seen. The humiliation still lingered in her memory, but the pride growing in its place began to heal what had been broken. She had thought herself untouchable, shielded by her role and emboldened by the passenger's silence, but the revelation had toppled that illusion. She had not humiliated just a child. She had targeted the daughter of a man whose service, rank, and honor carried weight far beyond this cabin. The tide had turned, and the balance of power now crushed down on her with merciless force. Elias did not move quickly, nor did he speak. His silence, sharpened by authority, carried more than words ever could. He remained tall and composed in the aisle, his hand still steady on Talia's shoulder, his posture declaring both protection and judgment. The passengers, sensing the moment, no longer turned away as they once had. Their silence had shifted from guilt to expectation, awaiting stillness, as though the entire cabin had agreed that justice was now inevitable. Talia's breathing had steadied under her father's hand, her humiliation dissolving little by little into pride, her small frame no longer shrinking but sitting upright with the quiet strength of a child carried by the dignity of her protector. Janice tried to compose herself, her hands gripping the service counter at the galley, her posture stiff, her lips pressed into a thin line, but every attempt at control betrayed the crack of fear widening beneath her uniform. She stepped forward, her shoes clicking against the aisle floor, her jaw tight, her face pale. Her voice, which had been sharp and commanding throughout the flight, failed her now. She opened her mouth as though to speak, to explain, to disguise her cruelty as duty, but nothing came. The passengers watched, their expressions cool, their judgment sharp. The very audience she had once manipulated with humiliations now turned against her. Another attendant, drawn by the rising tension, emerged from the galley. She glanced at Janice, then at Elias, and immediately her posture shifted. She approached Elias cautiously, her eyes flickering to the insignia on his chest, the metal pinned with such precision, and recognition dawned on her face. She swallowed nervously, fumbling for words, before stammering out a nervous apology, offering water, offering comfort, desperate to undo the damage. Elias said nothing. His silence was not just refusal, it was condemnation. The passengers murmured softly, their voices hushed but unmistakable. They spoke of what they had seen, of the suitcase dragged into the aisle, the meal denied, the cookies taken, the blanket tossed. Their words spread like ripples, the story now carried openly across the rows, every passenger reinforcing the reality of what had been done. The silence had broken, and in its place was a collective acknowledgement of cruelty and injustice. The captain returned, his face drawn with seriousness, his eyes locking instantly on Elias. His nod was deeper this time, his voice quiet but deferential as he addressed him directly. acknowledging his rank, acknowledging his presence, acknowledging the gravity of what had unfolded. He gestured toward Janice, his tone sharp now, ordering her to step aside. She froze, her body stiff, her face draining further, but she complied, moving reluctantly to the empty rear seat of the cabin. The passengers watched with grim satisfaction, some whispering, some nodding, some sitting back with visible relief. The tables had turned completely. The woman who had strutted through the aisles with arrogance and disdain now sat stripped of authority, exiled within the very cabin where she had once wielded power. Talia's eyes followed her father as he adjusted his uniform once more, ensuring the insignia gleamed under the dim light, his calm presence commanding the respect that now saturated the air. She felt the pride swelling in her chest, her humiliation dissolving fully into strength. She leaned slightly against his hand, steady now, her breathing calm, her face lifted. She was no longer the child who had been forced to clutch her backpack for protection. She was the daughter of a man whose authority had reclaimed her dignity before the very eyes that had once pitted her. The passengers responded with subtle gestures, some inclining their heads toward Elias, others meeting his gaze with respectful acknowledgement. Even those who had looked away during the humiliations now found themselves compelled to look directly at him, their silence no longer one of fear, but of solidarity. The transformation was complete. The cabin that had once been complicit was now a witness to justice. Janice sat rigid in her new place, her eyes downcast, her hands gripping her knees tightly. She could feel every gaze on her, could hear the murmurs that condemned her, could sense the collapse of the authority she had believed unshakable. Her arrogance had not just been stripped, it had been turned against her. Her every act of cruelty now evidence against her in the tribunal of public judgment. She sat small, diminished, erased not by a blanket, but by her own disgrace. The airplane flew steadily across the night sky, its engines humming with the same rhythmic certainty that had carried it from the beginning. But inside the cabin, everything had changed. The weight of silence, once filled with guilt and complicity, had been transformed into a quiet reverence, and every passenger now understood the true balance of power. Elias Merrick stood calm and resolute in the aisle, his uniform visible, his insignia gleaming, his decorated medal resting on his chest. His daughter Talia sat beneath his steady hand, her posture straightened, her humiliation fully replaced by pride. The cruelty that had been inflicted on her had built its own stage, and now that stage had been turned into a tribunal where every passenger had borne witness to the truth. Janice Rourke sat at the back of the plane, her posture stiff, her face pale, her authority shattered. The woman who had strutted down the aisle with arrogance and disdain was now diminished, stripped of her control, her power dissolved in the face of a greater authority that she could neither match nor escape. The murmur of passengers filled the cabin, their whispers recounting what they had seen, their tones no longer fearful but indignant. Every act of cruelty was repeated aloud, each humiliation remembered in detail, and with every retelling the judgment against Janice grew heavier. No longer could her actions hide behind the shield of silence, because silence itself had broken, replaced by the undeniable presence of witnesses who now spoke in unison through their recognition of injustice. The captain made his way down the aisle once more, his expression solemn. He stopped near Elias, his tone deferential as he addressed him, promising that the incident would be recorded, that proper action would be taken, that what had unfolded in this cabin would not be forgotten once the plane touched the ground. He gestured toward Janice, his authority firm, his decision final. She would not serve for the remainder of the flight, and upon landing, she would face immediate investigation. The words carried weight, not because they were spoken loudly, but because they came in the presence of a man whose service and sacrifice gave them gravity. The passengers nodded quietly, some even sighing in relief, their unease now released into a recognition that justice was finally taking root. Talia's eyes lifted to her father's face, her expression filled with awe. She had endured the long hours of humiliation, had felt the sting of exclusion, had felt the shame of being marked and erased. Yet now those wounds were met with the steady pride of being acknowledged, defended, and honored. She understood now that his silence had not been abandonment, but patience, a patience that allowed the truth to reveal itself fully so that when it was answered, it would be answered completely. She leaned closer to him, her small frame no longer curled inward but lifted, her chest rising with confidence, her dignity restored by the strength of his presence. As the plane began its descent toward the city lights below, the tension in the cabin shifted once again. Airline representatives had been alerted on the ground, and as the wheels touched down with a soft thud, the promise of accountability grew closer. The passengers remained quiet, their eyes watching as the doors opened and the air bridge connected. A small group of airline officials stood waiting, their postures formal, their faces pale as they stepped forward. They bowed their heads slightly as Elias and Talia approached, their voices subdued with apology, their words carrying the weight of embarrassment and regret. They knew who he was now, they knew what had happened, and they knew they had no choice but to make amends in front of every witness who had seen the truth unfold. Janice was escorted from the plane under the cold, condemning stares of the passengers she had once looked down upon. She kept her head lowered, her step stiff, her authority gone, her arrogance replaced with the heavy shame of disgrace. She had believed she could act without consequence, that cruelty disguised as authority would be accepted, but her own actions had built the case against her, and now the consequence was inescapable. The passengers did not speak to her, but their silence was filled with judgment. She left the cabin not as a figure of power, but as an example of how arrogance collapses under the weight of truth. Elias did not gloat, did not raise his voice, did not humiliate in return. He simply walked calmly with his daughter, his hand steady on her shoulder, his silence carrying the dignity that had defined his every choice. To those who watched, his silence was louder than any words could have been, a lesson in composure, strength, and justice. He paused at the gate where the airline representative stood, listened quietly to their apologies, then gave a simple nod before continuing forward, his daughter beside him, her head held high. The passengers, who had sat in complicit silence earlier, now rose slowly, many of them carrying the weight of what they had seen and what they had failed to stop. Some approached Talia briefly, offering gentle nods, small gestures of solidarity. But the truth remained that it had taken her father's revelation for them to find their courage. The shame of their silence was theirs to carry, but so too was the lesson. Silence in the face of cruelty is not neutrality, but complicity, and justice requires not just recognition, but action. As Elias and Talia stepped into the terminal, the hum of the busy airport surrounding them, the message of the flight remained etched in the memory of everyone who had witnessed it. The cruelty had been sharp, the humiliation deliberate, but the justice that followed had been undeniable. A child's dignity had been reclaimed, arrogance had been humbled, and silence had been transformed into acknowledgement. The story of what happened on that flight would spread, not because Elias demanded it, but because every witness carried it with them, a reminder of what they had seen and what they had learned. For Talia, the flight that had begun in fear ended with pride. She walked beside her father, her head lifted, her small step steady, her heart filled with the knowledge that dignity can be taken for a moment but reclaimed forever. For Elias, the flight ended not with vengeance, but with the quiet satisfaction of justice achieved. His silence had allowed cruelty to expose itself fully, and his revelation had turned the tide not with anger, but with dignity. He had shown that true power is not in domination, but in restraint, not in cruelty, but in justice, and not in words, but in actions. The end. If you followed the story all the way through, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Did the turning point strike you as powerful? And how did you feel about the way justice was finally delivered? Share your opinion about the plot and let me know where you're watching from, because hearing from you helps me understand how these stories connect across different places. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more stories that highlight courage, dignity, and the fight against injustice, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Your comments, likes, and subscriptions keep these stories alive and allow us to bring even more powerful narratives straight to you.